Good morning, 9 o'clock kind of thing. So welcome back. Since you asked, it was on this date in 1096 that the Worms massacre took place. The Worms, that has nothing to do with the death of the little Worms. It's a city in Germany, in the Rhineland, Germany, as part of the First Crusade, led by a guy named Count Emrico, who's was going on their way from the west to the Holy Land to rescue it from the non-believers. And literally, they got to the Rhineland area of Germany, specifically Worms, the city of Worms, which becomes popular about 500 years later for the Diet of Worms, where Luther was. And they discovered that there were 1,000 or so, or a large population of Jews there. And one of their thoughts was, and I'm not making this up, why go all the way to the Holy Land to kill non-believers when we've got non-believers right here? And so about 1,000 Jews were killed. Um, Another reason, this is one of those things that's in the psyche of, you know, people that, kind of, yeah, I remember the Crusades kind of thing that kind of we're still living with. Another great example of Christianity when it's got power. Also in 1291, the last Crusader fortress fell. The city of Acre, Ecre, or it might be pronounced Acre. I'm not exactly sure how it is, but that was the last Crusader outpost. There were still other crusades trying to. This was a city in Israel, that area, Palestine, that the from the first crusade, which was in 1096, up until 1291, so for about 200 years, was held by Westerners. Um, in 1756, the 7 Years' War started. 7 Years' War, as we like to call it, the French and Indian War. That was that war where it trained all of our, as a result of the French and Indian War, which was the British on one side and the French and Indians on the other. Um, and we were the British, by the way, just so everybody's clear. We are the British, and we don't like the French and Indians in this particular war. But the cost of this war to Britain was so much that they decided, you know what, we got to get some money out of those British North American colonists, and so let's start doing some taxes. And next thing you know, it's the Revolutionary War against them. But that started on this date in 1756. In 1812, we talked about this last week, but John Bellingham was hung. John Bellingham was hung. This was the guy who shot the British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval in the House of Commons. So a week after the deed, he's dead. He was hung, tried, convicted, executed. 7 days. Just saying. That's just how they worked back then. In 1830, Edward Budding of England. Now this is a guy I don't, if I have one guy that I just don't like in history, it's this guy. Edward Budding of England signed his agreement for the manufacture of his new invention. Does anybody know what his new invention? What did Edward Budding invent? No, close. The lawnmower. He invented he invented he invented the lawnmower. So yeah, my life would be great if we didn't have to deal with lawns and lawnmowers. And contrary to popular belief, planting something in the middle of the yard doesn't make the lawn easier to mow. Because then you just kind of, mowing my lawn now is an obstacle course because you have to go around all of these plants and things like that. So just saying. In 1926, evangelist Aimee Semple McPherson. Has anybody heard of Aimee Semple McPherson? She was a very well-known evangelist, Assemblies of God, Pentecostal evangelist, found tremendously successful, had a lot of success early in the TV or in the video recorded era kind of thing. But one of the things that she did was she disappeared in Venice, California, and reappeared a month later and claimed she had been kidnapped. Investigations later kind of poked holes in a lot of these her story. It's indicated that she had taken off with the guy who was to become her next husband. She was married 3 or 4 times. But she was a very successful evangelist. She started the Angelus Temple in California, which is still there, and it's still a very large Pentecostal charismatic church. One of the things about it, I mean, say what you will about Amy Semple McPherson. I read a biography of her a few years ago, and there's a new one that just came out, like just recently, within the last month or so. One of the things about the Angelus Temple in Los Angeles, was that during the Depression, the city of Los Angeles basically turned over all of their, or I should say, a lot of their work for the poor to the temple, because the city couldn't handle it, so they just and so during the Depression, the Angelus Temple was responsible and brought together a lot of the work for the poor in that community of Los Angeles. See, in 1945, the Detroit Tigers and the Philadelphia Athletics, both two different baseball teams, have 7 straight baseball games postponed by rain. 7 in a row. Just saying. You think the weather is bad yet? There you go. And finally, it was on to say, where were you in 1980 when Mount St. Helens erupted? It was on this day that it went. So yeah, that's our thing for today. All right. So last time we're in 2 Samuel chapter 7. I know it says up at the top 8 and 9, but the heading and the footer I kind of change last, and sometimes I do it right, sometimes, well. So we're in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and we're finishing up the discussion of the Davidic covenant. If you remember, David, like the raccoon under our deck, was saying to himself, here I live in a house of cedar, and why don't I make a house for the Lord here, build a temple for the Lord? Keep in mind, one of the things that David is trying to do is he's trying to centralize Jerusalem, his home, his city, as the central city in Jerusalem. And one certain way to do that is to make a permanent temple, so that everybody would know, if you look to Jerusalem, that's where all of the things are, And so this is one of his goals, and this is consistent with that goal. And the Lord comes to him and says, no, you're not going to. You're not the guy to do it. And we talked about this last week. Says, well, I didn't ask you to build me a temple. Why did you, but what I am going to do for you is I'm going to build a house for you. And we talked about the fact that the house in that time period, or the translation of that word, could mean house or could be dynasty. And we use that a lot. We use that the same way. We talk about the house of Versace, or the house, or as Debbie reminded me, of course, the great dynasty that we like to refer to as Shea Ray. It's the great Ray dynasty, something like that. And so the Lord gets us and says, I'm going to make a promise to you. I'm going to build a house for you. Okay, now, and there we think he's talking about a dynasty, because David already has a house. He's already got this palace that was built. And so the Lord says, I'm going to build this dynasty for you. And this is one of the things that we look to as evangelicals, 2,000 years later, and say, look, the fact that the Lord said to David, my love is not going to depart from you. Okay, and the verses at the bottom, when he's talking about David's descendants, he says, when he does wrong, I will punish him, but my love will never be taken away from him. Okay, so why those of us who are believe in eternal security, the idea that once you are saved, you're not going to lose your salvation. And why? Well, because we trust God when he says, my love will never be taken away from him. Just like it would never be taken away from the house of David, will never be taken away from those who trust in him, kind of thing. And we ended up last time at verse 18, where David is responding. And it's interesting, and I talked about it last week, that David's response to the Lord and the Lord's message to David are both almost exactly the same length. Okay, so draw whatever conclusion you want from that. But here in verse 18, it says, King David went in and sat before the Lord. And I mentioned that this is the only time in the Bible you have an indication of somebody sitting before the Lord and praying. Okay, every other time the person is either standing or they're prostrate, or lying down on the ground, face down, kind of thing, bowed down. But here King David went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, and then David's response recognizes several things. It says, "Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant, and this decree, sovereign Lord, is for a mere human." Okay, so David's reply recognizes that he and his family are not worthy. Okay, so David didn't do anything to deserve what he got. Okay, any more than we can do anything to deserve the love of God in our own life. Okay, so David was chosen just because David was chosen. Okay, what more, verse 20, what more can David say to you? For you know your servant, sovereign Lord, for the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. Okay, so the promise to David here was made for God's sake, not for David's. It's just a representation of who he is, who God is, not necessarily for David, that I have chosen you and I'm going to stick with you whether you like it or not, kind of thing. Okay. Now, again, for those of us who, there's within Christianity, there's sort of a spectrum in terms of various sundry doctrines, specifically those relating to salvation. And one of them, it has to do with salvation, as far as can a person lose his or her salvation? And there are some who say, on the one hand, they say, absolutely not. There's nothing you can do to lose your salvation. There's nothing you can do to gain your salvation. There's nothing you can do to lose your salvation. And on the other hand, you have people who say that, yeah, of course you can lose your salvation. You look at and both of them have interesting arguments. It's an interesting discussion, and a lot of ink has been spilled on it. But basically, you have on the one hand, the shorthand is this, these are the Calvinists over here, and on the other hand, you have the Arminians who are over here. And can you do anything to lose your salvation? Could David have done anything that would have lost God's love for him? No. Believe me, he tried. Okay, we're going to find out. David is going to do his best. Okay, but even today, we still think about the house of David, and all that. In fact, we're going to talk about some things today that David did that we're going to go, wait, what? But yeah, God continued to love David just like God continued to love us. Now, your typical Baptist position in this is the way I like to put it, is that we are Calvinist enough we are Arminian enough to believe that you can choose to be saved. So again, there's also, can you choose to be saved, or no? You have no choice in the matter. You have choice in the matter. We are Arminianist enough to believe that you can choose to be saved, and Calvinist enough to believe you can't lose it. I know it's kind of spreading the line, but we're right about here. And periodically, someone will come in who's on one side of the spectrum or the other, and it always makes for an interesting moment or two. But this is kind of where we get this eternal security idea. Starts here. Like, my love will never be taken away from you. Okay, so again, one of the comforts we can take, even as David is doing his best to make God forget about him, God doesn't, kind of thing. And as bad as it gets for David and for the kingdom of Judah and for the kingdom of Israel all through the history, we still know that God loves them. They're still God's people. In fact, the next thing, he recognizes the nation of Israel is God's people. It's not David's people. How great are you, verse 22, how great are you, sovereign Lord? There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears. And who is like your people, Israel? The one nation on earth that God went out to redeem as a people for himself and to make a name for himself and to perform great and awesome wonders by driving out nations and their gods from before your people, whom you redeemed from Egypt. Okay, so I know there's one question: Did God? One of the criticisms of Christianity is to say seriously, God picked this one person out of all of the ones and made them his nation. Yes. But if you read through Isaiah, and if you were with me when we went through Isaiah, you get a lot of that. The whole point was that Israel was supposed to be, operative word there, was supposed to be, the shining city on a hill, an example that people would come to and say, we want to be like that. We want what that nation has. We want the relationship with the maker that nation has. Now, did it ever make it? No. I don't think it ever reached that point where the nation of Israel was such that people said, wow, we want to be just like the nation of Israel has. And one of your distinctions in terms of end times prophecy, and again, this is getting way off the topic, but far be it from me to stay on the topic. One of your distinctions in end times prophecy is to determine, okay, so what is the role of Israel in end times? Is there a role for Israel in end times? And so if you're, some would say, one approach is to say that the church, what we are, the body of Christ today, has replaced the nation of Israel. Others would say that the nation of Israel is still distinct from the church. And, there are good people on both sides of that, and we're not going to get into that. Maybe someday I'll go into Revelation when I'm feeling brave, and but that's not a promise. I'm just telling you. Someday, when I've done the other, I think Revelation was the one book that John Calvin did not write a commentary on. He wrote a commentary on every book of the Bible but John Calvin. I'm sorry, but he wrote his own commentary on himself, I guess. But Revelation. So maybe I'm following the John Calvin approach. When I've been through the other 65 books, then I'll go, okay, what's left? But be that as it may, getting back to the topic. Okay, so you have established your people Israel as your very own forever, and you, Lord, have become their God. Okay, and now, Lord God, now this is kind of interesting. David makes two imperatives. Okay, an imperative is commands. Hurry up. It's an imperative. Be quiet. An imperative. It's a verb tense. If you're learning foreign languages, it's a verb tense where it's a command. So David is commanding the Lord here. David is telling the Lord what to do. It's kind of an interesting thing. But like if you read through the Psalms, if you're kind of praying through the Psalms, you think a lot of that is imperative. You're just telling the Lord, do this, do this. Not necessarily asking. He's not asking, but he says he makes two imperatives of the Lord. Number one, and now, Lord God, keep forever the promise you have made concerning your servant and his house. Keep forever the promise you have made. This is an imperative. Okay, that's just again, he's not asking. He's not. Please, Lord, if it's okay, if it's your will, would you please, do? He's not. He's just saying, keep this promise. Okay. This is a promise that God has made. And so again, this is kind of an example of something that we can do. It's like when God promises this is going to happen, this is something we can claim. We can say, do this. You said this was going to happen, do this. Kind of thing. Okay? And the second one is to do as you have promised, so that your name will be great forever. So do as you promised, so that your name will be great forever. I mean, David realizes that by God keeping his promises, it's going to glorify himself. And again, this was all done for God's glory, not for David's, not for Israel, not for ours. Okay? So do as you promised. Then people will say, the Lord Almighty is God over Israel, and the house of your servant David will be established in your sight. Lord Almighty, God of Israel, you have revealed this to your servant, saying, I will build a house for you. So your servant has found courage to pray this prayer to you. Sovereign Lord, you are God. Your covenant is trustworthy, and you have promised these good things to your servant. Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. For you, Sovereign Lord, have spoken, and with your blessing, the house of your servant will be blessed forever. Okay. In the end, although David wanted to build a house, it was God who built a house for David. Okay, so again, David had a plan. I'm going to do this for God. God says, no, you're not going to do anything for you. And, sometimes you think about that. Again, this is one of those, I don't want to, spiritualize the text. Spiritualizing the text is where you look at a narrative, you look at something, especially in the Old Testament, and say, well, if it did it like this in the Old Testament, we need to do it too. Okay, so, and this is the lesson. Because David said, kind of, or especially in terms of narrative text. But the blessing, so now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, the Lord. Okay, in the end, although David wanted to build a house for God, it was God who built the house for David. So David, wanted to do this thing for God. And sometimes we look at our Christian, for lack of a better word, I'm going to call them obligations. And we think, okay, you know what? I'm going to do this thing for God. Yeah, this is going to chalk up in my, I'm going to do a favor for God. I'm going to help him out here. I'm going to give God a little assist, and I'm going to get little points on the board for an assist to get kind of, and it doesn't work like that. And when David is right, when he's firing on all 8 cylinders, when he's a man after his own heart, God comes in and says, no, listen, it's what I'm going to do for you. You just obey. You just do what I tell you to do, and we'll all be good, kind of thing. So, moving on into chapter 8. Any questions? So that's pretty much the Davidic, what's called the Davidic covenant. It's that covenant, that agreement, that binding agreement between God and David. And the agreement is God says, this is what I'm going to do for you. Your household is going to remain. Chapter 8, beginning with verse 1. And then we have a series of victories from David. Okay, so this should go quickly. Operative word there is should. In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. And he took Metheg Ammah from the control of the Philistines. So finally, verse 1, David defeats and subdues the Philistines. And the Philistines are not a significant threat for the rest of the Old Testament. They're not gone. They're still there. They'll come back. But they're not the significant threat. Up and through Judges and Samuel and Saul, it was always the Philistines. Philistines this, Philistines that. Finally, David subdues the Philistines. Okay. David also defeated the Moabites. Now, this is weird. I'm just going to go right out here and we'll just read it. And this is strange for a number of reasons. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So basically, David went dead, dead, live, dead, dead, live, dead, dead, live, dead, dead, live, dead, dead, live. Now, this is weird. By 2025 standards, this is really strange. Okay, what is going on here? Especially when you consider that David is, in a sense, a Moabite, right? His grandmother is from Moab. His grandmother is Ruth, right? Grandmother, great-grandmother, grandmother. Grandmother is Moab, from Moab, okay? And ironically, and again, this is the difference in perspective, that by 2025 standards, we would look at this and say, well, that's, if we found out that some leader in a country had done this to a foreign country, we would be up in arms. We'd be, genocide or mass killings, whatever you would call it. By whatever this is, 1,000, I think it's around 1,000 BC, this could actually be considered merciful. That the fact that he allowed a 3rd to live is considered merciful. Okay, it's strange, and I go, this is one of the problematic elements of the Old Testament. You look at this and go, yeah, and I'm trying to justify it or whatever, just saying by that standard, letting them live is merciful. Yes.
Footnote says such was a common practice of Eastern kings. Okay. So it was not a new thing.
Yeah. And then he said they subdued him. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. Okay. Moreover, David defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River. Okay. It's kind of interesting here in verse 3. So Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when this king, Hadadezer, goes to restore his monument. Remember Saul had a monument, kind of, and he goes to restore his monument, and David captures or attacks and defeats him. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariots' horses. Okay, David's treatments as the Moabites could be seen as merciful, though barely. I mean, again, it looks weird from our standpoint. Okay, David defeated the king of Zador and hamstrings 900 of their horses, which you think, wow, that is cruel, kind of thing. But one of the things in the Torah, in Deuteronomy 17:16, there's some instruction in the Torah, and this is about what a king should or should not do. Okay, I mean, and this is one of the problems when you look at the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. People say, well, why is there instructions for a king in the Pentateuch if there wasn't a king at the time? And so it must have been written later, which is one argument. Some would say, yeah, but then again, it was an inevitability that this would happen. But one of the things that Moses says in Deuteronomy that a king should not do is accumulate a lot of horses. And hamstringing a horse is basically intentionally injuring it in such a way that it basically can't walk, or certainly isn't going to run. It certainly can't be used as a war thing. He's not. So the Torah says don't. So here you have David, as cruel as it seems, he's simply following what the Torah told him to do. So David is firing on all 8 cylinders here. He's doing stuff. Then he says in the next, when the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. So David in hamstrings, and the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Tebah and Berthai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze. So David's accumulating a lot of valuable stuff. When Tou, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tou. Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. So David is accumulating even more stuff. Okay. David dedicates here in verse 11, David dedicated these articles to the Lord as he had done with the silver and gold from all of the nations he had subdued. Okay. So David dedicated his spoils of war, or his plunder, to the Lord, because in Deuteronomy 17:17, the same passage where it says you're not supposed to accumulate a lot of gold, a lot of horses, says you shouldn't be accumulating a lot of gold either. So David says here, okay, I'm going to dedicate this to the Lord. Gives it to the fund that's going to eventually build the temple that Solomon will use to build the temple. Okay, build and maintain the temple. So why is Solomon able to build such a grand temple? Well, David has been saving up the money for him to do this all this time. Let's see. So we'll go from the nations: Edom and Moab, the Ammonites and the Philistines and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zoab. And David became famous. Okay, David was so successful he became famous. David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites. These are the descendants of Esau in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. And again, the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Okay, that is not an error. That is the second time the author points out that at this point in David's life, the Lord is giving David victory. Because again, David is firing on all 8 cylinders, okay, or all 4 chariot wheels. I don't know whatever the appropriate thing was at that time, okay. So David is at this point in time, David is a man after God's own heart. He's looking to follow through with what the Lord told him. He's following the Torah commands. He's eliminating these nations that they had been told to eliminate, or he's at least subjugating these nations that the Lord had said, these are people you need to get rid of. He's making sure that he doesn't accumulate horses. He's making sure he doesn't accumulate gold. Verse 15. In summary, verse 8:15, David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Okay, so the summary of David's rule at this time was that it was just and right for all his people. Okay, not just the friends of David. Okay, not just the ones who supported him, for all his people. Okay. Now we get a couple of verses here where it kind of lists what often people refer to as David's cabinet. These are the people who are helping David run the country. Joab, son of Zeruiah, who is David's sister, was over the army. Okay, and Joab again, we've got issues with Joab, right? I mean, Joab killed Abner, and David called down a curse on Joab, but quite a impressive curse on him. and yet he's still there. And again, that's an indication of something, that David is not good dealing with his own family. Not that any of us are. Okay, so I'm just saying, it's I know we like to think, oh, I would never do that, but it's like, when it's your own family, it's kind of hard to deal with this. And he says at one point, these sons of Zeruiah are too much for me, kind of thing earlier. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was, you can practice saying these names all you want. When you're up there trying to say them, it's like, okay, this guy and that guy and this guy. Jehoshaphat was the recorder. It was just kind of like the clerk, the one who was writing stuff down. So there are some who suggest that he is the person who is the author of this story. What does he do? He's the recorder. He's the one writing things down. But there are other books mentioned throughout the Old Testament, the book of the Annals of the King, things like that. Maybe those, or maybe the official records that have been lost. Zadok, son of Ahitub, priest. Okay, so Ahitub is related to Ahimelech. Ahimelech is the king who gave David the showbread when he was running from Saul. So this is his son or his grandson, depending on how you look at it. Okay, he's related to them. Sariah was secretary. Do I have him on there? No. He's a grandson of Ahimelech. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. Okay, Benaiah, who is this? He is one of David's mighty men. Okay, so I just kind of throw that out there. This is something that will come back at the end. At the end of the book of Samuel, there's like an epilogue, and some of these things come up, and there's this list of David's mighty men. There's the 3, and then there's the 12, and there's all these different people, and Benaiah is one of them. So he's like one of David's great warriors. Okay, when David needs a guy, he needs a guy who can get a job done, call one of his mighty men. And another one of his mighty men is Uriah the Hittite. Just saying. We'll get to that later. So, and David's sons were priests. Okay, now this is kind of, David's sons were priests. Now David has a lot of sons. Don't get me wrong, he's got a lot of sons. And this is sort of problematic because of all the things David is, what is he not? He's not a priest. He's not from the tribe of Levi. Okay, but yet David's sons were priests. And we've already talked about David's doing these sacrifices. Well, see, now the words in some translations, does anybody have a translation where it says David's sons were chief officials? Yeah, of the court. Yeah. Right. So again, there are some that'll say, well, it couldn't be priests. Yet we've got David doing priestly, sacerdotal responsibilities, priestly things. He's doing sacrifices, he's praying to the Lord, he's inquiring of the Lord, kind of thing. So sometimes, and again, I mean, I get where we got a writer who sometimes just, David inquired of the Lord, and what actually could have happened is David said to Abishai, hey, ask the Lord this and all that. But still, we see David sacrificed. Remember the ark took 6 steps, stop, sacrifice a bull and a calf, kind of thing. We see David doing these priestly functions, and we see David's family doing priestly functions as well, without any commentary. Just there it is. Okay, so there isn't any indication on the part of the writer that there's anything wrong with this. And again, we talk about Jesus being our priest. We have a great high priest in Hebrews talks about that. Well, Jesus isn't from the tribe of Levi either. Okay, now again, Jesus is a little different. Okay, there's a few more qualifications than David does, but so and you've got the story, I think is in Hebrews, where they talk about a priest after the order of Melchizedek, that there was a priestly order set up in Genesis, or clearly there was in establishment. Melchizedek was a priest in Genesis, and he was not a Levite. So that's when the author of Hebrews talks about, says, well, the priesthood is not limited to just the Levites. Okay, there is a precedent here. And so one of the precedents that we have for Jesus being our priest is that, well, David acted in priestly ways, and his sons were priests here. Okay, So again, it's just presented as a fact that David's sons were priests. Okay. Now, again, another way to look at this is another way for David to make sure he's got people everywhere. Okay. People everywhere in that. Okay. And David's sons were priests. Okay. So by the end of this passage, the end of verse, whatever that verse was, that's chapter 8, verse 17 or 18. David is established. Okay, David is established. He's got his people in his places. He's got the ark where he wants it to be. He's got, the nations around him are subdued. Everything is kind of calm, sort of. They reaches this point. Okay. Now we begin chapter 9. Okay. Now chapter 9, beginning from chapter 9 through chapter 20 of Samuel, 2 Samuel, some people have referred to as the succession narrative. That we start the next phase. So the first phase up until all the way through 2 Samuel 8 is David establishing the kingdom, centralizing the kingdom, getting everything in order. And now, beginning with chapter 9, we start the story of whether or not who's going to be the next king, that it starts here. Maybe not. I don't know, chapter 9, maybe chapter 10. But just so you know, some people you'll see if you ever pick up, you're walking through the bookstore and you see a commentary on Samuel and you go, hey, I'm going to read that. And they talk about the succession narrative. You'll know what it is. That's what it is, okay? But in chapter 9, after David has succeeded in accomplishing a stable kingdom, the kind of kingdom that God wanted, David remembers that he's got a promise to keep. Okay, and this is kind of the main thing I want to talk about here today. Now remember, previously, in 1 Samuel 18, Jonathan and David are having a conversation. And we talked about this at the time where Jonathan and David are pledging loyalty to each other. And Jonathan says to David, don't ever cut off your love to my family. Okay? Don't ever cut off your love to my family. That's in chapter 18, 1 Samuel 18:15. And David agrees, I will never do this. This continuing loyalty, or the Hebrew word there is hesed. It's that love that it's translated a lot of different ways: kingly love, undying, godly loyalty, love. A lot of different ways it talks about this kind of the love that God says to David. I will not let my love will never be taken away from him, kind of thing. And Jonathan says to David, don't ever cut that off from me. Okay, and David agrees. So now David is there. He's in the kingdom, and he says, previously, we also know from 2 Samuel chapter 4, if you remember, there was this odd little parenthetical. There was like 2 verses stuck in the middle of the story, that there's a son of Jonathan named Mephibosheth. Okay, it's just stuck there in chapter 4. Chapter 4, just like David is doing this, there's this. Oh, by the way, Saul's got a grandson living named Mephibosheth, who's lame in both feet because when the war started, picked him up and tried to get out the door, dropped him, and injured his feet in such a way that it was never healed. Okay, so is he like in a wheelchair? How can he walk with crutches? We don't know. Okay, but he's lame in both feet, kind of thing. So we know that. The reader knows that. David apparently does not. Okay, I mean, he's been busy. I get it. He's been busy. So, but he says, David asks in chapter 9, beginning with verse 1, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness? This is Hesed, for Jonathan's sake. Now he's saying, is there anyone from the house of Saul? Okay, Saul had several children. Is there anyone from the house of Saul that I can show kindness to in order to keep my promise to Jonathan? So this is like kind of a general, he's just asking a group, hey, does anybody know? Any of you guys know? Maybe he's having a cabinet meeting. Goes, any of you guys know of anyone? Okay. Now, there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. We find out later that he was Saul's steward. He kept track of Saul's goods. He was, maybe he was very high. I'm guessing he was very highly ranked. We'll find out later. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? So the meeting goes, hey, does anybody know if there's anybody left of Saul's household? And somebody says, hey, well, you know what? His steward lives around the corner from me, a guy named Ziba. Let me bring him in, and you can ask him. So Ziba comes in, They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. Now I'm getting ahead of myself here because I think it's a question later on. Ziba is a problematic character to me. It's kind of hard to say, okay, is he a good guy or is he a bad guy? So he's a guy. Okay. He was Saul's steward. It certainly profited him to be working for Saul. And when Saul lost the kingdom, he no doubt lost his main source of income. It stands to reason. I'm speculating here, so you can disagree with me if you want. Okay. But he's a problematic character, and it's going to take several weeks before you find out why. But I'm just telling you now. Okay. So the king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Hesed. Now, if you're Saul's steward and your livelihood for the past 35 years or 40 years or however old you are, and I'm guessing this guy's in his 50s or 60s, because we'll find out later he's got 15 sons. Okay, and that takes some time. Okay, and so I'm just saying. So I'm not, he's not 20 years old. Okay, I mean I guess it's possible, but it's not likely, right? So and the king, and again, think about how kings work. Okay, kings are like, succession is a big deal. You don't want anyone who has a claim to the throne other than who you want to have a claim to the throne, meaning your son. So when the king says to you, "Hey, is there anyone from my rival's family that I can show God's love to?" and you're a representative of that family, you know, you have every reason to think, okay, yeah, this guy's on the up and up, which I believe he was. Okay, I believe David was sincere, that he really truly wanted to show God's kindness to Saul's family. Ziba, on the other hand, maybe not, kind of thing. So he says, Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." That's interesting that he points out that there's this one guy. Now, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. There are other descendants of Saul alive. We're going to find out later about them. Okay? There are other descendants. So Ziba gives up Mephibosheth and says, "There is this guy Mephibosheth, but he's lame in both feet." Okay? Now, to a certain extent, you could say, well, he's the one most in need of David's help. On the other hand, you could say somebody who is lame in both of his feet is the least threatening to David. Again, we don't know. We just know the story of what's happening in Ziba's mind at the time. Now, I think David is sincerely trying to fulfill the promise he made to Jonathan. Okay? And I guess the lesson here is sometimes you can be sincerely trying to do the right thing, but you still have to deal with people. It's like some people have said, ministry would be so much easier if you didn't have to deal with people. Okay? And I remember talking to a guy one time, a former Moody professor, who was talking about how pastoral studies have evolved. And he said they found at one point that they were getting people going through pastoral school, Bible school, taking that loved the Bible, but didn't like people, kind of thing. And it's like, okay, that's not a good pastoral qualification. Okay, we really don't like dealing with the messiness of people. And so here, David, I think, is 100% sincere in what he does. Ziba, on the other hand, problematic. Okay, I'm just saying, because again, there are several other descendants of Saul alive. Okay, and David asks for anyone, and he just gives him this grant, which of course fits into David's very specific thing he's promised to do. Okay, David didn't promise Jonathan that he would protect all of Saul's family. He promised that he would protect Jonathan's family. Okay, but regardless, so he gives he gives up Mephibosheth, and so when he says there's still a son of Jonathan, but he's lame. Okay, so maybe maybe Ziba's thinking he just wants to kill him, and so Ziba's answer could be translated. This is the Stand translation, and given my Hebrew scholarship, take it for what it's worth, which is to say none at all. Say, yeah, there is one, but he's no threat to you. Okay, he's no threat to you whatsoever. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered, he is at the house of Maker, son of Amiel, in Lodabar. Okay, now Maker is a guy who's going to come back again too. He's going to turn out to be a great supporter of David later on. And Lodabar is believed to be near Jabesh Gilead. Anybody remember Jabesh Gilead? That was the town that was very sympathetic or very pro Saul. That's the town that sent people to get Saul's body. That's, and David, one of the first things David does is send out thanks to the town of Jabesh Gilead. So it's in that area where they believe Lodabar was. Okay, but that's where Mephibosheth is. Okay. So King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Maker, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. Let's see here. Dedicated, Joab. Previously, David, don't ever cut off your love to my family. Previously, we know Jonathan has a son named Mephibosheth. David in chapter 9, verse 1 says, in general, is there anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness, that is hesed, for Jonathan's sake? So David is willing to show anyone in Saul's family kindness, hesed, for the sake of Jonathan. So David is actually literally going beyond what he specifically promised. Saul's steward, named Ziba, is still around and ready to answer. Again, David asks, is there somebody from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness, that is hesed? Ziba identifies the son of Jonathan, but he is lame in both feet. There are other members of Saul's family still alive. Son of Jonathan is at the house of Maker in the town of Lodabar, near Jabesh Gilead. When Mephibosheth comes, and this is where we are now, when Mephibosheth comes before David, he bows to David. And remember that David bowed before Saul. They made a big point about that. David bowed before Saul to show, again, when after the spear and the water bottle thing, that David bows to say, listen, I recognize who the king is. David, this was a good thing about David and Mephibosheth. Hey, listen, I recognize who the king is. And the fact that I could talk about his bowing makes me think that he can walk. Okay, maybe with sticks or not sticks, crutches, something, a walker, whatever. I don't know if they had the fancy kind, like Gene's got over there, the racing variety, sort of, but he can get around, but he's lame in both feet, but he can bow. And he says, now at first there's no indication that David knows his name, but at some point he's found it, he's discovered it. David says, Mephibosheth. Okay, David recognizes him. He bows. David has learned Jonathan's son's name, Mephibosheth. He bowed down to pay him honor. At your service, he replied, which is the same way Ziba replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness. This is that same word, hesed again. So it comes up 3 times in this chapter. I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. David reinstates Mephibosheth, repeating his promise to show kindness, hesed, that is, to his family, that is Mephibosheth's family. David returns all of Saul's land to Mephibosheth and promises him access to the king's table. So you will eat with me all the time. And David got to eat with Saul's family. Now Mephibosheth is going to eat with David's family. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Now this is not unlike, again, Mephibosheth realizes, hey, I didn't, this is not unlike David's response to the Lord. My family's not worthy. And Mephibosheth realizes, wait a minute, you have, under the morality of the time, you have every right to just kill me. Because I am a claimant to the throne. I could start a revolution. People want the old ways back. And, you always see that sort of stuff happening if you follow any royalty, monarchy, there's cousins and brothers and things that run off, and next thing you know, they're leading a revolt against their brother or cousin. Okay, we talked about heard of Mary Queen of Scots. She was a cousin of Queen Elizabeth in the 16th century. Mary Queen of Scots was brought. There's an interesting movie about it with Saoirse Ronan, and I forget who the other actress is. But Mary Queen of Scots goes to Scotland, and then she's a cousin of Elizabeth I. So she's an heir to the throne. She's a claimant to the throne. I don't know where she is in the line. Periodically, especially in England, you see it, but not every once in a while. You'll see an article about the British monarchy, and they'll list off, what the order is, like who's next, kind of thing. And they've got like, I think they keep the list to like 20. Who's somebody who is the 17th in line to the throne, who's like the Earl of something or something, kind of, the Earl of Bolingbroke, something over there. I guess it's Bolingbroke. There is a town called Bolingbroke. There was a time when, is Bolingbroke, who lives in Bolingbroke? You live in Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke used to be, because I grew up in Bolingbroke. So there was a point in time where Bolingbroke became sister cities with Bolingbroke in England. Is it still that way? It was, yeah, this was a while back. It was all the rage to be a sister cities kind of thing. And so Bolingbroke picked Bolingbroke. But that's beside the point. That won't be on your test. Or maybe it will be, just to see who's paying attention, kind of thing. So you have every right to kill me. And so ultimately, Mary Queen of Scots is convicted of, even though she's living in England with Elizabeth, because she's a claimant to the throne, people who want to overthrow Elizabeth are kind of gravitating toward her. And ultimately, Elizabeth has her executed, because I can't have a claimant to the throne that close to me. Somebody I don't want to be the next king or queen. Okay, and so the morality of the time was, you can just kill me. You're the king. Do it, And Mephibosheth, and David says, no. You're going to come to Jerusalem, and you're going to eat at my table. Okay. Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. Now the question there is so what had Ziba been doing? Okay, so and Mephibosheth, grandson, will always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Okay, so David put Ziba in charge of ensuring Mephibosheth gets all that David promised. Ziba is a problematic character here. He has 15 sons and 20 servants, which suggests that on his own, Ziba is a fairly wealthy man. Okay, that's a lot of servants. That's a lot of sons. Doesn't say how many daughters, doesn't say how many wives, doesn't say what he owns, what he's in charge of. Had he taken control of everything that was Saul's? We don't know. Okay, we just know on his own he's wealthy, but now whatever Saul owned, David says, hey, guess what, Ziba? Whatever you have that's yours, let's say for sake of discussion, Ziba has an honest plot of land over there that he uses his 20 servants for, and he says, you and your servants are not going to be responsible for what used to be Saul's. Or conceivably, what used to be Saul's is now under the control of Ziba, and Ziba has been profiting from it. Again, I'm speculating, and I say that because later on, Ziba comes back in a problematic way. So we don't know, but now, guess what? You now report to Mephibosheth, this guy that was out in this town that was lame in both feet, that was no threat. He's now your boss. Okay, so if you've ever been in a situation where somebody who, you're working at a job and there's an opening above you, and they give it to somebody who is younger than you and less experienced than you and less educated than you. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. It's not a fun moment. You kind of go, wait, what am I? What? Yes.
So it's also interesting because the Bible keeps referring to this young man as crippled. He's crippled. He's damaged.
Mm-hmm.
It keeps bringing that up, and now the Ziba is serving a disabled man.
Yes.
It's interesting.
And he had been serving the king.
Yeah.
And now he's got this guy who apparently will never be king. Kind of, yeah, yeah. I'm sorry.
That's one of the reasons why he mentioned him to David, because he thought he might have control of the situation. I don't know.
Could be. Again, Ziba's the Ziba Mephibosheth thing is not over yet. Okay, so Ziba said, your servant will do whatever my Lord commands his servant to do. Okay, which is a very, depending on how you read it, and again, it's a translation, I get that, but it's a very passive aggressive way to agree to do. Okay, Ziba, you're in charge of all of this. Okay, you're speaking about yourself in the third person is a very, when Debbie says, will you get me a glass of water? I say to her, your servant will do whatever you ask me to do, kind of thing. And that sometimes that goes over well, but not always. You could just say yes, kind of thing, sort of. You kind of it's a little weird way to answer, right? I mean, it's just kind of a okay, sure, Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, could be pronounced Micah, but Micah, and all of the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem. So he's moved from Lodebar to Jerusalem. Okay? Because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. Again, he's no threat to the king. Although some critics look at this and say, David now has him under house arrest. That David knows exactly where Jonathan's son is at all times, kind of thing. So is that true? Yes. Is that the point? I don't think so. But, call it what it is. I mean, one, potato, tomato, I don't know what the thing is. Because he always ate at the king's table. Okay, any questions? Again, Ziba and Mephibosheth come back together. I mean, there's just a weird little parenthetical epilogue to their story, which kind of makes you go, wait, what? Something to look forward to. Okay, next week is Memorial Day weekend. So there is not an ABF next Sunday. Okay, the title of our next lesson is going to be the beginning of the end. Because we're in 2 Samuel 10, which is where the the Bathsheba story starts. Okay, most people think it starts in chapter 11. It doesn't. It starts in chapter 10. So we're going to start talking about the beginning of the end for David, kind of thing. So, any questions? All right. Pardon me?
We'll save them up.
Say okay. Well, no, you can ask now. Again, if you're like, did he really say that? You just check the YouTube page and you can say, yeah, he really did say that, sort of thing. All right. Thank you very much. We'll see you here in 2 weeks.